I've met Ria, yeah.
Yeah, Ria, you maybe others also, yeah.
Sure. I'm a first-year PhD student in history and probably work on music and nationalism in political.
Hi, I'm Dhruv. I'm a third-year undergrad studying South Asian studies, and I'm a trainee student at SWAN.
Hi, I'm Vidya. I'm also a student. I'm a second year. I'm studying South Asian class.
I'm Sri. I'm just happy to be here with both the professor and Auntie. I teach in the religious studies department.
I'm Bob Grant, a community member and always looking to close some gaps in my knowledge, and the James Lawson connection is, I think, a pretty serious gap, so.
Thank you. Glad you're here.
My name is Rohan. I'm a second year undergraduate studying engineering and international affairs.
Ayappa?
Yeah.
I'm Jim Jackman, second year political theory graduate student. We had our random, I study conceptual violence.
My name is Luja. I'm a third year student in political science. So I study state, identity politics, etc.
I'm Natalia. I'm the events coordinator for Cecilia Center.
I'm Shreya, second year political science PhD. I study bureaucracy and India.
Hi, I'm Maya. I'm a second year political science PhD as well, and I'm doing history and American studies.
I'm Paul Pandey. I'm a senior commentator for Sahitya Center.
I'm Arushi. I'm a PhD student in economics and I study community tensions and social media in particular.
I'm Azra. I'm also a photographer.
Let me formally welcome you all. I'm Ashutosh Varshney, Director of the Saxena Center. It's a very great pleasure to welcome Rajmohan Gandhi back again at Brown. He's been here twice, once in this room 5-6 years ago, and then 11 years ago when he gave the lecture in Salman Hall on Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King. I think it was Martin Luther King Day. I may be slightly wrong about that. Maybe a little later or a little earlier, but the topic was Gandhi and Martin Luther King. Rajmohan Gandhi is a scholar, an editor, commentator, and a former member of parliament. Which, if you follow Jürgen Habermas's conception of intellects, that's a paradigmatic public intellectual. Paradigmatic public intellectual. Writing for the public sphere, participating in public sphere in a vigorous way. Author of more than 15 books as a historian and a biographer. Some of the biographies were hugely enlightening that I read. Gandhi, the man, his people and the empire. Patel, a life. Rajaji, a life. But the one that I have used most in my classes is a set of short biographies. It's collected, that set is collected in a book called Understanding the Muslim Mind. And the 3 chapters that it's around the major Muslim figures of modern India, modern South Asia, and the 3 figures 3 chapters that I use from that book are one on Sir Syed, one on Jinnah, and one on Maulana Azad. His latest book is Fraternity, Constitutional Norm and Human Need, published this year, which I received last night. A member of the upper house of Indian Parliament from 90 to 92, editor, as I said, of Indian Express, and before that, a very courageous weekly called Himmat, which I don't think exists anymore. No. I think it ended in early 90s, right?
Even before that, in early 80s.
And emerged during the emergency. Correct or no? More or less.
Yeah.
Okay. But he edited also the paper for which I've been a columnist for 13 years, Indian Express. He edited from Chennai, from Madras at that time, from 87 to 89. Now, twice I've heard him on Gandhi and Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, his grandfather, and Martin Luther King. And today we are discussing an important figure in civil rights movement that I think a lot of people don't know much about. It's fair to say. So he'll be filling a very important gap. But before I proceed further, let me just show you what I discovered, how I discovered the relationship after his lectures, the relationship with Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi. So I went and spent a fair amount of time during the winter break of 2019, a few months before COVID, in Atlanta. And I went to every Martin Luther King site that was available there, including, of course, his house and his church. And this is the first column of the Martin Luther King Jr. National Historic Site. 6 principles of nonviolence, fundamental, this is the first column, I'll show you just 3 columns from there. Fundamental tenets of Dr. King's philosophy of nonviolence, described in his first book, Stride Towards Freedom. Dr. King often said he got his inspiration from Jesus Christ and his techniques from Mohandas K. Gandhi. These principles should be embraced as a lifestyle. Column number 1. Column number 2. Principle 1, nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. It is active, nonviolent resistance to evil. It is aggressive spiritually, mentally, and emotionally, meaning not physically. Principle 2, nonviolence seeks to win friendship and understanding. The end result of nonviolence is redemption and reconciliation. The purpose of nonviolence is the creation of beloved community. And finally, this one, I won't give you all 6. Nonviolence recognizes that evildoers are also victims and are not evil people. The nonviolent resistor seeks to defeat evil, not people. Anyone who's read Gandhi will clearly recognize this as a cardinal Gandhian principle of civil disobedience. That you hate the sin, not the sinner, where that also comes straight from Christianity as well, or allies with Christianity as well. And then these 2 pictures I picked up from the museum next door. One is police officers and dogs attack demonstrators under the order of Commissioner of Public Safety Eugene Bull Connor. So hunting dogs are attacking civil resistors, and they are not hitting back. They are not hitting back. And here is the fire department of Birmingham. This is Birmingham, Alabama, right? Of the fire department of either Montgomery, Alabama or Birmingham, Alabama, using power hoses, the extra power water hoses to shut down the demonstration. Once again, very reminiscent of civil disobedience in India. Very reminiscent, not exactly these things used, but the principle is the same. Principle is basically the same. So he'll also show you a video a little later, but the larger point here is that we understand the relationship between Martin Luther King, who then ended up spending 6 months in India, I think in 1957, 56?
59.
59.
Yeah.
6 months there, 11 years after Mahatma Gandhi's death. But we don't know the relationship between Mahatma Gandhi's ideas, Gandhi himself and his ideas, and Reverend James L. Lawson, who I was told by him, by Rajmohan, is a major theoretician of the civil rights movement. And Ria also added to that the other day. So I'm looking forward to learning about this. The title of his talk is Resisting Supremacy, the Dogged and Unfinished Life of Reverend James L. Lawson. Welcome, Rajmohan, once again.
Thank you, thank you.
And look forward to it.
Thank you, Ashu. Thank you, Ashu, very much, and thanks to everyone who has come, I say almost during spring break to this conversation. I'm most appreciative of this. I should add that last December, with my wife Usha and who's my associate in my research, we went to Nashville, Tennessee, where at Vanderbilt University, all the papers of James Lawson are now stored and preserved. But you and the Saxena Center helped my visit to Nashville.
It's a great pleasure.
So thank you for that. Okay, so if we can have those very short video clips about James Lawson. So how do I have that? Okay. Am I obstructing? Yes, I am. So I'll get away. So this is when John Lewis died a couple of years ago.
Pastor, sisters and brothers, members of this Lewis family that so wonderfully nurtured John in love, hope, and courage, faith, and the rest of it. And sisters and brothers, Czesław Miłosz, a Polish Catholic poet, sets the tone, at least in part for me, as John Lewis has journeyed from the eternity of this extraordinary, mysterious human race into the eternity that none of us know very much about. When he wrote this poem called Meaning, when I die, I will see the lining of the world, the other side, beyond bird, mountain, sunset. The true meaning ready to be decoded. What never added up will now add up. What was incomprehensible will become comprehended. And if there is no lining to the world, if a thrush on a branch is not a sign, but just a thrush on a branch, if night and day make no sense following each other, and on this earth there is nothing but the earth, even if that is so, there will remain a word, wakened by the lips that perish, a tireless messenger who runs and runs through interstellar places, through revolving galaxies, and calls out and protests and screams. And I submit that John in that other eternity will be heard by us again and again, running through the galaxies, still proclaiming that we, the people of the USA, can one day live up to the full meaning of we hold these truths. Live up to the full meaning, we, the people of the USA, in order to perfect a more perfect union. John Lewis practiced not the politics that we call bipartisan. John Lewis practiced the politics that we, the people of the US, need more desperately than ever before, the politics of the Declaration of Independence, politics of the preamble to the Constitution of the United States. I've read many of the so-called civil rights books of the last 50 or 60 years about the period between 1953 and 1973. Most of the books are wrong about John Lewis. Most of the books are wrong about how John got engaged in the national campaign of 1959-60. This is the 60th year of the sit-in campaign, which swept into every state of the Union, largely manned by students because we recruited students, but put upon the map that the nonviolent struggle begun in Montgomery, Alabama, was not an accident, but as Martin King Jr. called it, Christian love has power that we have never tapped, and if we use it, we can transform not only our own lives, but we will transform the earth in which we live. I count it providential that as I moved to Nashville, Tennessee, dropping out of graduate school, in Nashville came people like Kelly Miller Smith and Andrew White and Janetta Hayes and Helen Roberts and Dolores Wilkerson and John Lewis, Diane Nash, C.T. Vivian, Marion Barry, Jim Bevel, Bernard Lafayette, Paulina Knight, Angela Butler. How all of us gathered in 1958 and 59 and 60 and 61 and 62 in the same city at the same time, I count as being providential. We did not plan it. We were all led there. And when Kelly Miller Smith and the Nashville Christian Leadership Council met in the fall of 1958, and we determined that if there's to be a second major campaign that will demonstrate the efficacy of satyagraha, of soul force, of love truth, that we would have to do it in Nashville. And so I planned, as the strategist and organizer, a 4-point Gandhian strategic program to create the campaign. We decided with great fear and anticipation we would desegregate downtown Nashville. No group of black people or other people anywhere in the United States in the 20th century against the rapaciousness of a segregated system ever thought about desegregating downtown, tearing down the signs, renovating the waiting rooms, taking the immoral signs off of drinking fountains. But it was black women who made that decision for us in Nashville. I was scared to death when we made that decision. I knew nothing about how we were going to do this. I had never done it before. but we planned the strategy. John Lewis did not stumble in on that campaign. Kelly Miller Smith, his teacher at ABC, invited John to join the workshops in the fall of 1959 as we prepared ourselves to face violence and to do direct action and to put on the map the issue that the racism and the segregation of the nation had to end. And so in the 60th anniversary of that sit-in campaign, which became the second major campaign of the nonviolent movement of America, those are not my words. John Lewis called what we did between 1953 and 1973 the nonviolent movement of America, not the CRM. I think we...
Thank you. Now, all of you have heard of David Halberstam, born in 1934, 90 years ago. Halberstam is famous for his Vietnam book. He published 2 books in the 1960s, 3 in the 70s, 4 in the 80s, 6 in the 90s. He would have published 6 or more books in the 2000s had he not been killed in a car crash in California in 2007. In 1999, Halberstam commented that his best book, also his favorite book, was The Children, as he called it, first published in 1998, which is in part about John Lewis, about whom you have just seen, when Lewis was only 18 or 19, and about Lewis's young teammates in America's great nonviolent struggle for justice in the 50s and 60s, people that you have just heard named. However, this book, The Children, is even more about Reverend James Morris Lawson, Jr. Born in Pennsylvania in 1928, active today at 95 in California, who in 59 and 60 had trained these and other young Americans in nonviolent action in Nashville, Tennessee. In March 2020, when I began researching for my study of Reverend Lawson, I asked him if he thought Halberstam's portrayal of his life until the 1960s had been accurate. Yes, replied Lawson, adding, Halberstam was one of our finest reporters. I read the book again last year, he said. I again gave it a high rating, unquote. In his historic I've Been to the Mountaintop speech in April 68, shortly before he was killed, Dr. King spoke of Lawson as one of the noble men who had influenced the black freedom struggle. Quote, he's been going to jail for struggling. He's been kicked out of Vanderbilt University for this struggling, but he's still going on fighting for the rights of his people, unquote, King. Some days before these remarks, on the 18th of March of 1968, when King spoke at a mammoth rally in support of the striking sanitation workers of Memphis, King called Lawson, quote, the leading theorist and strategist of nonviolence in the world, unquote. Now, some years ago, I met a very well-known, influential African-American figure. I will not name him. He held one of those very prestigious appointments for which the Senate has to ratify. African-American, influential, nationally known figure. He had never heard of Reverend James Lawson. Lawson is the son of Philaine May Cover, who was born in Jamaica but had moved as a young woman to the east coast of the US, and the son also of Reverend James Morris Lawson Sr., who was born in Ontario, Canada, to Reverend Henry Lawson. As a boy, Henry had fled across the border from the US along with his father shortly before the start of the Civil War. The boy Henry went on to become a Methodist minister in Canada. The son of Henry, James, also became a Methodist minister in Canada, but moved back to the US during or just before or just after World War I. We don't know exactly when. After 2 sons, Edwin and Mark, were born to them, James Sr.'s first wife died in Jamestown, New York. Arriving in Jamestown, Philaine from Jamaica attended James Sr.'s church. After she and he married, Lawson Sr. pastored in at least 5 churches in different towns of upstate New York. One result was that their 5 daughters, Dorothy, Betty, Ella, Frances, and Daisy, were born in 5 different cities: Jamestown, Elmira, Rochester, Syracuse, and Ithaca. Persisting with tradition, the Methodist Church moved Lawson Sr. to yet another city, this time in Pennsylvania, called Uniontown, where he pastored at the John Wesley AME Church. It was in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, that James Lawson Jr., that you've just heard, arrived. James Jr. would later say, quote, "After 5 straight girls, parents were clearly seeking a boy when I arrived. That explains me," end quote. The overjoyed father named the son after himself. Decades later, James Jr. would admit, surprising nobody, that, quote, "2 much older brothers, 5 older sisters, my mother and my father spoilt me, doted on me," adding in the next breath, quote, "I always felt secure in my life," unquote. 3 more sons followed James Jr., entering the world again in 3 different cities: William, John, Philip. Finally, Paul was adopted as their 5th son and the father's 12th child. When James Jr. was 4, Philaine decided that wherever the Methodist Church sent her husband, she and the children would not move from Massillon, Ohio, one of Ohio's steel cities, where Reverend Lawson Sr. had recently been posted. A lot of land, a portion of land, was bought at the edge of Massillon City with white as well as black neighbors, and a house was duly built. This new house had 4 bedrooms, of which the largest, Reverend Lawson told me, quote, "double the size of all the other bedrooms," unquote, was for the girls, with 2 double beds and a single bed. Across the hall, he said, from them was our boys' small bedroom, where my parents had placed 2 bunk beds. We had a very large walk-in closet. We were very comfortable here. Presumably, this is me saying, the 4th bedroom was for a visiting house guest. 2 years ago, in May of 2022, courtesy of owner Horace Ward Jr., I saw this house, 33 Bruce Avenue, Massillon. It's an attractive wooden brick house with a sloping roof through which a 2nd story, topped by another sloping roof, rises. There's green grass in front of the house on both sides and behind the house. The lot is not small. You see a few towering trees on the lot at the back. Displaying 3 tall front windows, the 2nd floor is about 2/5 as broad as the 1st floor. 3 concrete steps bring you to the front door of this house. After you've entered through it, there's a living room to your right, a wooden stairway to your left, and straight ahead, a passage to the rear of the house, which comprises of a kitchen, small kitchen, with a door to the back garden, and a relatively small dining room. The stairway leads to the bedrooms, which are on the 2nd floor. For the 12 Lawsons who lived in it for years, 5 girls, 5 boys, and the parents, the house was not large, which, however, is how to this day it is remembered by Reverend James Lawson Jr., one of only 2 surviving children, Philip being the other. The big open porch remembered by the Reverend, but missing when I saw the house, should have contributed to the impression of size that he retains. Close to this house was the warm, nurturing St. James's AME Zion Church, where James Sr., an imposing personality, preached, and where young Jimmy Jr. felt right from junior school that he would become a pastor too, and where he often told himself that he would follow Jesus. He tells us he had a protected childhood and boyhood in 33 Bruce Avenue, Massillon. He always had his clothing and his shoes. He never had to miss a meal. But there were no indulgences. Apart from being a literalist who believed in the Bible's words, the pastor was against drinking, smoking, and gambling. So was Philaine. Card games were firmly discouraged. However, it was a home of laughter and activity. James Sr. was, in fact, a committed activist. Wherever he was sent to preach across America, he founded a local unit of the NAACP, or he pumped up an existing NAACP unit. He also promoted the Urban League. For his sons, the pastor desired learning, but also toughness. Showing Jimmy a gun he had acquired when serving with the church in Anniston, Alabama, the father declared, "I'm going to be a man." Now, the pastor's oldest boys, Mark and Edwin, lived in Cleveland, which is about 30 miles from Massillon. To Philane's children, and especially to her boys, Mark and Edwin seemed a lot older and bigger than they were. Occasionally preaching in that big city, frequently taking Jimmy Jr. with him, Reverend Lawson Sr. would spend time with Mark and Edwin, or they would show up in Massillon. Quote, "Mark specially would come to visit when we moved to Massillon," the son told me, "and I went any number of times as a youngster with my father to visit Mark in Cleveland." In June of 21, when speaking to Reverend Lawson over the telephone, I used the phrase half-brothers for Edwin and Mark. James Lawson interjected with a correction that was given with a characteristic chuckle. "They were our older brothers," he said. "We never thought of them as half-brothers," unquote. Another relative the children engaged with. Hello. So another relative the children engaged with in this house in Massillon, Ohio, was Uncle Harry, Philane's brother, who lived for a while in the Lawson home in Massillon before moving to Great Britain. 2 or 3 years after the big move to the Bruce Avenue house, something else happened to 10-year-old James Jr., then in grade 4. Running back home from school on a beautiful spring day, Jimmy had entered the kitchen from his home's rear door and begun a conversation with his mother, who was cooking, when she asked him to run an errand to a store about 7 blocks away. Leaving through the rear door, which I had seen in this house, leaving through the rear door, he was pacing toward the store on his sidewalk when a white child in a parked car shouted, "Nigger." The car's windows were down, and the child standing on the back seat had poked his head out. Jimmy stopped, strode to the car, slapped the kid, and resumed his errand. On its completion, he proudly related what had happened to his mother, who, quote, "was still in the kitchen working as she heard the story," unquote. Her response has been recorded by the son. Without turning to me, she said, "Jimmy, and what good did that do?" Jimmy could see the profile of her face, not its front. Maybe she couldn't turn her head because she had to watch the cooking fire, or maybe she could turn her head but did not because she wanted him to face the truth, not her. This is James Lawson, the words I'm quoting now. The mother, she then did a long soliloquy about our lives, about who we were, about how God loved me and Jesus loved me, about how no one could rob me of my humanity unless I did it myself, about our home, about our congregation. Our last sentence was, "Jimmy, there must be a better way." And in many ways, that's the pivotal event of my life as Reverend Lawson Jr. Now, in January 2017, an 88-year-old James Lawson recorded on video this recollection from a time about 78 years earlier. He has recalled this incident elsewhere too, multiple times, including to Halberstam for his book. In November 2011, when he was 83, he spoke of that moment at Boston University, not far from here. Quote, "Ours was a loud household, with the radio playing and the piano, 3 boys going to schools, chicken and geese in the yard next to the kitchen, cats and dogs. But the world," he says, "came to a screeching halt and became absolutely still. I said to myself, never again will I use my fists on the playground when I get angry or someone else gets angry with me. And I heard myself saying, I do not know what that better way is, but I will find it," unquote. Jimmy was 10. On that beautiful spring afternoon, he had, quote, "adopted nonviolence as a way of life, although, as he says, I did not call it that, and I did not know that word."
How old was he at that time?
10.
10.
At BU in 2011, the Reverend also spoke of what he called his lifelong, quote, "wrestling match with a hostile, vengeful, mean, cruel, torturous society, and the resolve to sustain the humanity God has given me," unquote. Now, another point. James Jr.'s encounter with Gandhi began in the 1940s when he was at Washington High School in Massillon, Ohio. Gandhi figured in the newspapers that Jimmy was reading in that school, which included the New York Times, the Christian Science Monitor, and two black newspapers, the Cleveland Colin Post and the Pittsburgh Courier. This encounter with Gandhi was deepened when in the fall of 47, during his freshman year at Ohio's Baldwin Wallace College, not far from Cleveland, and within days of India's independence, Jimmy Lawson heard from a visiting speaker, A.J. Muste of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, FOR, about Gandhi's nonviolent struggle for India's freedom. In addition, young Jimmy, who had been elected class president by an overwhelmingly white student body, and Muste, they held one-on-one sessions discussing America's role in the post-war world, Gandhi, and nonviolence. And Jimmy also became a member of FOR at this time. Some weeks after Muste's visit to his college, Jimmy learned on campus that Gandhi had been shot and killed in India. That evening, quote, and late into the night, he listened to radio accounts of the assassination from London and New Delhi. This is what he's told me. Before the end of his time at Baldwin Wallace, where he became a star debater, Jimmy started to wonder why Gandhi-style nonviolent action was not being tried more in the US. Also registering on Jimmy's mind was struggles in African countries for freedom from European control. At a student conference in the Midwest in 1951, Jimmy had met Eduardo Mondlane, the future founder of Mozambique's Liberation Front, who was then a student at Oberlin College, Ohio. Meanwhile, the Korean War had started. Young men were being asked to register for the draft, which was in place from 1940. Imagining Jesus as, quote, a modern-day Jesus in modern dress, unquote, as someone with views on contemporary questions, including on whether or not to serve in the military, Jimmy concluded that as a follower of Jesus, he could not register. This is from Halberstam's book. A warrant was issued for his arrest. Jimmy turned himself in. He was tried in Cleveland and sentenced for 3 years in prison. Reminded by his FOR friends, Fellowship of Reconciliation friends, that Gandhi had used prison as opportunity for growth, Jimmy did just that. First at Mill Point in West Virginia, then in a Kentucky facility called Ashland, reading a lot, holding study sessions with fellow prisoners, assisting fellow prisoners when he could. On July 16, 1951, at Mill Point, West Virginia, Lawson typed a letter to a friend reporting that he had tightened a tire under a truck that had arrived at the facility, adding to his friend, quote, "This does not imply that I can fix a truck, only that some bolt was loose that any moron like myself could tighten," unquote. This I read recently at Nashville. In this letter, Lawson also described an imagined step-by-step nonviolent direct action in America. This is 1951. Please remember, 1951. The Montgomery bus boycott was 1950?
3.
No.
No?
No. It was
54.
55 or 56. 55 or 56, I forget.
Montgomery boycott.
Yes, 55 or 56. Okay. But in 51, Lawson describes an imagined step-by-step nonviolent direct action in America. This he writes in a letter, which I saw the other day. The process would start, he says, with self-improvement, quote, getting rid of hatred for the dominate group. Get rid of the hatred of the dominate group. Secondly, it would require a cooperative economics where poor whites break their economic chains. Then, finally, after much negotiation and talk failed to move those who could remove segregation, there would be a mass breaking of segregation laws and immediately packing the jails with both groups who want to live in harmony with each other. Are there any reasons, Lawson asks rhetorically, why we should not have such a revolution in our country? This letter was written, remember, in 1951. Now, the next prison where he went to, mean and menacing, Ashland, demanded all the resilience that 22-year-old Lawson could summon and more than that. A clique of prisoners sent Lawson a message asking for sexual favors. When Lawson demurred, he was cautioned that refusal could provoke gang rape. Halberstam has described, obviously he got it from Lawson, what happened, including Jimmy's fear of what was threatened, and for a while his uncertainty about how he should respond. Should he hit would-be attackers with a steel chair that stood within his reach? I should not reveal here what Jimmy decided or what happened. I will only say that the situation was identical to what a 40-year-old Gandhi faced in a Johannesburg prison in 1909. Not only was the situation identical, Jimmy's eventual response was identical to how Gandhi had responded. The outcome in the two cases, too, was exactly the same. Although Reverend Lawson is a remarkable student of Gandhi's life, he had not known of this coincidence of which I was able to inform him. Next point. In the center of India, in a city called Nagpur, which is famous for its tangerines, the Church of Scotland was running a college called Hislop College, named after Stephen Hislop, a Scottish missionary who had worked in areas surrounding Nagpur for 18 years until his death by drowning in 1863. In 1953, after he had served in these two prisons, Lawson joined Hislop as minister to Christian students at Hislop and sports coach to every student, and in order to study Gandhi further. He shared a faculty bungalow on the campus of Hislop College on Nagpur's prestigious civil lines. Most non-Indians in Nagpur owned cars, but Lawson was content with a bicycle. He was careful with water and food, but found the local fare just fine. His stomach coped with what he was eating. At times, he wore Indian clothes, he told me. Apart from helping with the students' spiritual and moral tone, Lawson was expected to raise their athletic abilities. This sports role brought him close to dozens of young Indians. It also enabled him to travel across India. A basketball team he trained at the Nagpur YMCA went with him to Madras, to Bangalore, Delhi, and Kolkata, all places where local YMCAs wished to promote basketball. These efforts did not have long-term results.
Basketball never took off in India.
Despite
where basketball heroes were, so many of them were black Americans, right? Very soon.
But James Lawson tried.
Yeah.
Living amidst Indians of varied castes, religions, and income levels, next to some non-Indians as well, Lawson sought to understand India's complexities. He could not agree with fellow missionaries who saw the Christian and Western worlds as synonymous, who were inclined to blame native religions for India's problems, including its poverty. To his surprise, Lawson found that some missionaries, as well as prominent Indians, seemed to disdain Gandhi. In their eyes, Gandhi had been too Indian or too much of a Hindu and therefore incapable of launching India into industrial or technological success. Moreover, some of them saw the Gandhi who had led a sequence of nonviolent revolts as, quote, a troublemaker. That Gandhi was a Hindu was not a problem for Lawson, who told me this in an interview, quote, well before my India visit, when I was in college and faced the draft question, I had become skeptical of the dogmas of Christianity. I was never in sympathy with the missionary enterprise that the people of the rest of the world ought to be converted to Christianity. I had formed the view that every person is a major category, an autonomous category, gifted with autonomy and with personal accountability for that gift. That the paths towards truth and God are manifold, very much more than one or two, unquote. Well before his India visit, he had formed these views. Lawson's admiration for Gandhi and for Gandhi's unbending opposition to British colonial rule grew in Nagpur as he continued his researches about the man. He found much to like also in Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, about whom he had read while studying Gandhi in the US. Lawson briefly met Nehru 2 or 3 times, heard him more often on radio or at conferences, usually on how to develop India via democracy, and Lawson empathized with Nehru's refusal to align with the US in the Cold War. He also traveled to Pavnar, 40 miles from Nagpur, where Lawson talked with Gandhi's close associate, Vinoba Bhave. who had inspired landowners across India to donate lands to tens of thousands of the landless. This interview was joined by a Christian Gandhian from South India, Lawson told me. His name, although is untraced, was apparently associated with FOR. Seeing himself as a student throughout of freedom movements in India, Africa, South America, Latin America, these are Lawson's words, he also got to know the African students who were studying in Nagpur. Now, among the Gandhi books that Lawson devoured in Nagpur was the two-volume Non-Violence in Peace and War, published in 1942. This book contained articles both by Gandhi and by Gandhi's secretary and associate, Mahadev Desai, who had died in prison during that year, 1942, in Pune. One of Desai's pieces in this book was an account of a 3-hour conversation occurring in February 1936 between Gandhi and an African-American delegation led by a man Lawson admired, the theologian-philosopher Howard Thurman. The others in that delegation were Thurman's wife, Sue Bailey Thurman, a Methodist minister named Edward Carroll, and the latter's wife, Finola Carroll. The four called on Gandhi in his hut in Bardoli in Western India.
Which part of America were they from? Do you remember? North or south? 36.
I can't now remember. Sorry, I can't now remember. Okay. Sorry.
We'll figure this out.
After Gandhi, this is 36. They had a tour of India, and at the end of it, they met Gandhi. After Gandhi, this 36 meeting between Howard Thurman and Gandhi is very well recorded, both at the Gandhi end and at the Howard Thurman end. After Gandhi had, quote, engaged his guests with questions about racial segregation, about lynching. So Gandhi meets these people and he asks them, what is the state of lynching now, racial segregation now, African-American history. There was a discussion about nonviolence. Gandhi claimed that despite the negative particle nonviolence was not a negative force. It was positive. It required direct action, Gandhi's words. Moreover, love was a critical component of nonviolence. Altogether, claimed Gandhi, nonviolence was a force, quote, more powerful than electricity or ether, unquote. Desai wrote that he and Gandhi had sat enraptured, his words, enraptured, as Sue Bailey Thurman rendered these two spirituals, were you there when they crucified my Lord, and we are climbing Jacob's ladder. Before the visitors left, Gandhi expressed to the visitors his belief that African Americans were going to lead the world in nonviolence. This is 1936. And this was quoted by Thurman when he came back to America, and it was also in Gandhi's papers. Lawson found the discussion and Desai's account of it, quote, extraordinary. In 2010, 57 years after he had first read Nonviolence in Peace and War, Lawson was speaking at Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina, for the 50th anniversary of the founding in 1960 of SNCC, SNCC, in which Lawson played a key role. Quote, it almost has become for me, he would say in 2010, referring to Nonviolence in Peace and War, quote, a kind of a piece of scripture because I learn something new from it all the time as I read it, unquote. In 2020, Lawson told me that one of the two 1942 volumes he had obtained in Nagpur in 53 still sat, quote, on a shelf above my desk, adding, I got it in 1953, I think, unquote. In May of 1954, a year after his arrival in Nagpur, Lawson learned of the US Supreme Court's Brown versus Board of Education judgment. Some 18 months thereafter, early in the morning of December 55, Lawson picked up his copy of the Nagpur Times from the threshold of his campus bungalow, brought the newspaper inside to his desk, and saw a startling front-page story from a city deep in the American South, Montgomery, Alabama. Thousands of Montgomery's African Americans, the report said, had begun a boycott of the city's bus company following the arrest of a black woman named Rosa Parks, who refused to vacate a bus seat she had paid for. Whether Lawson merely shouted with delight at the story or also jumped and danced has not been precisely recorded, but he remembers running excitedly to his neighbor and friend in the bungalow, an Indian biologist named Chris Theophilus, who asked "What in the world is going on with you, James?" Showing Theophilus the front page, Lawson added, "I knew this was going to happen. When I go home next year, I'm going to be part of it," unquote. Soon the two found that all the other newspapers in India were also carrying the story from Montgomery, as was the International Herald Tribune, which also reached some people in India. Quote, "That was the first time I read about Martin Luther King Jr.," said James Lawson.
Oh, I see.
In Nagpur, when he reads in the New York, Nagpur Times, 55. Between December 55 and Lawson read in the New York Times, the Nagpur Times of Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, and the summer of 56 when he returned to the US, he heard a lot more about this man, about his own age, who was from Atlanta, Georgia, and who was appointed to lead the boycott. Now, Lawson is 1 year older than MLK Jr. I don't need here to recall the incredible Montgomery story. In June 56, a federal judge in Montgomery ruled that segregation and discrimination on cities' buses violated the 14th Amendment. In December of that year, the Supreme Court upheld the ruling. Given these victories, and with King saying what Lawson had felt himself for some years, namely that merging a Christian conscience with nonviolent struggle would prove irresistible, Lawson asked himself whether Gandhi's prediction to Howard Thurman in 1936 of an African-American intervention in our world story wasn't starting to come true. Next point. However, Lawson was not going to rush back home. Friendships with African students in Nagpur had whetted his wish to see Africa's lands, almost all of them in 56 still colonies of Europe. So there is his trip to Africa, which is very interesting, but I think to save time I will not discuss that, but it's quite amazing. His trip then I will not describe how he met King at Oberlin, which is quite well known, and the incredible thing that happened in Nashville in 58, 59, 60, which you heard something of in that clip. And the storm at Vanderbilt University. Lawson was kicked out of Vanderbilt. He was arrested.
For what?
For leading the rebellion.
Leading the rebellion.
But then, by this time, already things were beginning to change. The impact of the struggle in Montgomery and elsewhere was happening. And some of the professors at Vanderbilt opposed the expulsion of Lawson. And afterwards, a year after, Lawson was brought back. A full apology was not made, but was invited. There is now a James Lawson permanent chair. And so the man who was kicked out of Vanderbilt is now the star and the emblem of Vanderbilt University today. That's another story. But then another big story is of what happened thereafter in Memphis in 68. This is before, of course, Vanderbilt recognizes its errors. But the Methodists post Lawson as a minister now, just as they were posting his father, now they're posting him. So he gets, by the way, because he's expelled from Vanderbilt, he couldn't get his divinity degree at Vanderbilt. He got his divinity degree at BU. And then he is sent to Memphis, to the Centenary Methodist Church there. And in Memphis, as I think most students of King and African American history know, that incredible sanitation strike, which was led by Lawson. Lawson invited King to Memphis. And at that big rally in Memphis, in the, what is it called? It's called the Mason Hall, a huge hall. Huge rally, one of the biggest that King had spoken to. That is when King called Lawson the chief strategist of nonviolence in the world. And then King is killed in Memphis. So this is one of James Lawson's permanent heartaches. So after
Very soon after this rally,
King gets killed.
MLK Jr. gets killed.
Yeah. And King is there because Lawson is invited. So you can imagine what Lawson feels about that. After that, he is posted to Los Angeles by the Methodists, and he's pastor in a church there. So those are very important. And incidentally, in California, an amazing chapter in Lawson's life. He then organizes labor. Of course, he led the sanitation strike, Memphis. But he organizes labor, and not just African American labor, Asian labor and Latin American labor. Incredible role he has played there. So I'm moving to a couple of other points now towards the end. I've taken a lot of time anyway. Since in recent years, Lawson hadn't commented on issues in the rest of the world, I asked him in December 2021, if African Americans are to demonstrate the power of nonviolence to the world, can they afford to turn their gaze away from cruelty practiced elsewhere? His answer, no. My commitment back in the 60s was that I was going to decrease travel for concerns for other people. Otherwise, in my work, the plight of Africa, the plight of India, the plight of Europe, the plight of Latin America remains very much on my mind as I wrestle with my own plight and the plight of my people here in the United States. But to me, the USA foreign policy has not been a blessing to the world. Then he spoke of US's Africa Command, of how the US had dealt with Ho Chi Minh, Lumumba, Allende, Castro, Mandela, Iraq. Then I said to him, quote, I was teaching at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. I told him, a bright African-American student said to me the other day, quote, there is no love in the school. Often there is no love at home. There is no love on the streets. I want to be rich enough to be able to give these children love. She told me. So I said to Reverend Lawson, do you have thoughts on how to live in an unbearable world that exhausts you?
Can you repeat that sentence? Do you
have thoughts on how to live in an unbearable world that exhausts you? So his answer, you face the pressure of a violent system, racism, male domination, sexism, plantation capitalism. By the way, this is his phrase, plantation capitalism. I asked him where he first thought of that phrase. And he said he, of course, thought of it again in Memphis when he was there. But he first heard of it from a cousin of his who was also in Ohio working on one of those steel mills. And in his steel mill, this cousin of his told him, this is like a plantation. So he thought of plantation capitalism as his phrase. Then he says, Lawson, my experience is not the experience of youngsters who grow up with great violence today, where they live, where the poverty, the lack of work for black people is the greatest, where in a few blocks there are more gunshots in a month than anywhere else in a year. He says that was not my experience. That was not C.T. Vivian's experience in Missouri and Illinois. That was not Martin King's experience in Georgia. It was not my experience. It was not the experience of Rosa Parks or of Annelle Ponder in South Mississippi. We became very aware of structures that oppress people, but we were also raised in families where there was a fortress of compassion and love and truth. In the case of Martin King and myself, for example, he says, it was not only a family, it was also a congregation of black folk who had essentially a different vision of life and tried to live out that vision. Then I asked him another question. How should individuals and groups in the US respond to people who press forward with the truck of supremacy? In India, I would call it a juggernaut of supremacy, with loudspeakers blaring the big lie. His answer, we need to provide an analysis that this thinking is wrong. The first thing is to recognize that this racism and sexism and violence and plantation capitalism are evil. The second thing to recognize is that you cannot overcome evil by following it. You cannot use the tactics or the structure of the wrong to correct it. You've got to find another place where you stand intellectually, spiritually, physically. The third stage is to figure out how in your own life you will represent the non-evil, the good, the just, how you personally will use your gift of life. And the fourth step, he said, is to figure out how you can involve others in extending this vision of what humanity is about. Now, in November of last year, I again asked him. In both the US and in India, drives for supremacy to replace democracy and equality as national norms seem to be growing stronger. White supremacy in the US, and in India, Hindu supremacy over its Muslims, Christians, and Sikhs. In this situation, what should be the role of people in both lands who were inspired by Gandhi, by Dr. King, and by King's close colleagues like yourself? He replied, one, well, we should be lifting up non-violent criticism of the violence. We should be lifting up criticism of the violence. Two, we should be telling the religions of the world, plus the Pope as well, that their religions ought to stop allowing people in their name to hate and despise other people. The religions of the world should become the first offensive line against hatred and violence. He goes on to say, let all the religions of the world stop pretending to be religious if they are continuing to support wars and violence by the police forces. Then he adds, in the US, the police force is still the #1 killer of black people and of Hispanic people. 3, we should be organizing at the local level to help people improve their economic and political situations at the local level. 4, we should oppose all those agencies in our world which teach the dehumanization of human beings for whatever reasons. So my conclusions, 2 conclusions. 1, we should recognize the tide of supremacy in the world. Toni Morrison, you all know her, the Nobel laureate, literature. Quote, she said, if you can only be tall because someone else is on their knees, then you're having a serious problem.
Beautifully said.
I say people across the whole world now have this serious problem, including Indians. What shall we do about it? And my last point, inspired by the unfinished and dogged life of James Lawson, African American and Indian scholars should explore how they can collaborate to address the troubling state of equality and dignity in the US, in India, and the world.
Thank you. Thank you, Rajmohan. Thank you very much. I'm so glad we were able to support this work. Thank you. Our